I'm going to say that it is May 10th, rough equivalent to May 10th. There's a lot to say about it, and I'm not going to read all of my prepared statement, but I do want to, I guess Ken just stepped out, I want to acknowledge the great work that Ken Levinson, Diego, and the WITA team have done in not just in this program and this series, but really building WITA as an organization. They've done really terrific work, as those of you who are involved in WITA know. So before I get to May 10, just some of the basics. TPP, the TPP trade agreement, incorporates certain international labor norms into the trade agreement. This is not a novelty. There are several previous free trade agreements that incorporate international labor norms and the requirement that they be adhered to by signatories. The TPP does spell out, and let me just spend a minute of this here. A lot of you will be familiar with this. Two elements of international labor norms. One are the norms that are incorporated in the ILO's declarations of rights at work. That goes to things like elimination of child labor, right to freedom of association, collective bargaining, matters of that sort. The second, which has not been mentioned in previous trade agreements, although I don't think it's really a departure from May 10, is another area of labor rights referred to as acceptable conditions of work. And this goes essentially to three things. You've got to have a minimum wage law, you've got to have laws governing hours worked. By the way, most countries in the world have this, right, on the books. They may not enforce them in all cases, particularly with regard to hours worked. But the only TPP country, by the way, that doesn't already have a minimum wage is Brunei. So these are not requirements that are big game changers, but incorporating them into TPP is important. And then finally, a topic that has been very much in the news, and it is a concern for many global U.S. companies, are occupational safety and health standards. Now, some people have said, well, aren't we going farther than May 10 in trying to incorporate international norms in these areas, in the latter three areas, into a trade agreement? Well, the way TPP is written, each country can enact laws that suit its needs and desires, and so while all three of these areas have to be addressed, you have to have a minimum wage law. It doesn't get into an issue like what is a living wage, what should the minimum wage be. That's left to the individual country to sort out through its political process. And after I go through, by the way, after I go through sort of the basic elements, I'm going to talk a little bit about what I think the implications are for future trade policy and future trade agreements in these elements of TPP and the approach thereto. All of the labor provisions are subject to a complaint process. So if we have a problem with the way in which Vietnam is implementing its obligations, the first stage is, this is standard sort of stuff in trade agreements. The first stage is a consultative process with deadlines to try to sort it out. Ultimately, these norms are enforceable through the standard TPP dispute resolution system. So these are all mandatory standards that can ultimately be enforced through the TPP's dispute resolution mechanism. In addition, actually three of the countries have consistency plans: Brunei, Malaysia, and Vietnam. There are ongoing conversations with Mexico, unclear at this point whether Mexico will adopt a consistency plan. I think it's likely that Mexico will do something to address concerns in this area where its practices are, where Mexican practices don't comply with Mexico's own labor laws, and I can provide examples, or with the international ILO norms. So I think there's an expectation right now that, well, that's not been addressed yet through a consistency plan, but it will be by the time this thing comes up for a vote in the Congress. The interesting thing about these consistency plans is that they, in my view, they don't in a substantial way go beyond May 10. But here's the thing. They provide a roadmap for implementation. It's whether it's labor standards or anything else in a trade agreement, when we're in a debate about, as we are now on TPP, we tend to greatly exaggerate on both sides, the pros and the cons, tend to greatly exaggerate the impact that a trade agreement will have. Now, trade agreements are really important. The TPP is extremely important for both reasons of stimulating global economic growth, protecting American economic interests, and protecting American national security, and actually regional security interests. In spite of how important it is, the proponents of it still overstate what it'll do, and the opponents overstate problems it's going to create. And one of the ways in which we often tend to overstate is there is, despite mechanisms for dispute resolution, whether it's ISDS or anything else, you don't get perfect outcomes. You don't get perfect enforcement. We've come to realize that there are limitations to what you can get through the mechanisms of a trade agreement. So having these consistency plans, which are kind of blueprints for how with more precision, how each of these countries will come into compliance, is a really interesting innovation. And I think it is something that we might see in other areas in the future beyond labor. May 10, just a word about May 10. May 10, the so-called May 10 agreement goes back to 2007. It was a deal worked out bipartisan between Democrats and Republicans on how to incorporate a number of social and environmental concerns into trade agreements, including incorporating these ILO standards in the ILO declaration. And that's something that is carried forward without a lot of partisan rancor. Ever since, it's in the recently passed Trade Promotion Authority legislation, which was agreed to, which was passed by a Republican-controlled Congress. And there's this notion, well, Republicans are going to want to kill any thing that has to do with labor. Well, incorporating those elements in TPA really wasn't controversial. Although there are some innovations in TPP, I think some really good innovations that go well beyond the significance in labor. There is no material difference in the standards and the norms that TPP is seeking to have implemented with May 10th. And the reason I make a real point of this is that critics on the right, critics of the TPP agreement will say, oh, it went beyond May 10, and therefore, and I'm being a little unfair because I'm generalizing, but there are some conservative critics who, well, it went beyond May 10, therefore it's not legitimate, and some critics on the left who say it fell way short of May 10 and it's not legitimate. If both sides think one side thinks it went too far, the other side thinks it didn't go far enough, that probably means it hit the mark pretty well. And in this case, I really think it did. So what does this mean for the future. One of the things we've learned in a number of areas of trade policy, but I'm going to focus here on labor, is that incorporating labor norms in trade agreements, even where they are enforceable under the terms of the trade agreement, does not mean you're going to suddenly get a high level of compliance, particularly in states that have very, very weak governance and rule of